time. Hello, and thank you for joining us today. Welcome to the official kickoff for the 2021 virtual conference on the value of play. Play is survival. My name is Stephanie Garst, and I'm the executive director of the U.S. Play Coalition. The U.S. Play Coalition is a nonprofit that's housed at Clemson University, promoting the value of play throughout life. Through education, community engagement, and research, we aim to connect play advocates, educate our national and global community, support play research and publications, and truly fulfill our mission to promote the value of play as a necessary part of a healthy and productive life. Thank you all for engaging with us virtually again this year in the interest of public health, wellness, safety, and education. With dozens of pre-recorded sessions, weekly live headliners, workshops, and networking events all through June, I think we could safely say that you will gain new knowledge and build meaningful connections with your peers. We continue to advance play with our great sponsors and partners because we know that collaboration is the key to our success. And we are excited that play has creatively united so many of our individual efforts. Thanks to everyone. Thanks to our sponsors and partners, our planning team, steering committee, volunteers, and everyone who has played a role in making this event a reality. Of course, that wouldn't be possible without all of you out there, cyberspace. We are glad that you are here with us. You are the heart and soul of the modern play movement, so thank you for being with us. As I mentioned, our headquarters is at Clemson University, and we acknowledge that the main campus of Clemson University occupies the traditional and ancestral lands of the Cherokee people. This is also land on which enslaved people lived and worked, and that was transformed into the campus of Clemson University through convict labor. We make this acknowledgement to remember the histories of violence and anticipate our gathering here, to recognize Indigenous and Black claims to life and land, and to recenter those claims as we commit to better ways of caring for each other and for this land. And this is why we're here today. We hope that through the open and honest voices of our guests, we can begin to reframe the way we think about play. One second. This is the hard work, y'all. I want to introduce our moderator, Huerta Migus. She's the executive director of the Association of Children's Museums. She is a noted speaker and author of topics of equity and audience-focused museum practice for institutions, including the Board of Science Education, the National Science of Academies, the U.S. Play Coalition. She has been with us before, thankfully, and various university texts. The Association of Children's Museum is in Arlington, Virginia, and it is the world's largest professional society promoting and advocating on behalf of children's museums and children's museum professionals. We also have Lysa Ratliff, the brand new CEO of Kaboom, and we are honored that we could be among her first official speeches, I suppose, or guest speeches. In early 2021, Lysa Ratliff became the newest CEO of Kaboom, the national nonprofit that works to end place space inequity for good. Throughout her career, she has served as a champion for kids and their resilience, leading efforts to connect partners and make change for communities and kids across the country and the world. She was VP of Partnership and Development at Kaboom and has held several senior leadership roles at Habitat for Humanity International and Save the Children. We welcome you here today. And our last but not least speaker is Dr. Christine Sims. She is Associate Professor in the Department of Language, Literacy, and Sociocultural Studies at the University of New Mexico. Excuse me. She focuses on issues of heritage language maintenance and revitalization among American Indian tribes. She specializes in Indigenous language revitalization and maintenance issues, provides technical assistance to Indigenous nations in language program planning, and trains American Indian language teachers. We are so honored to have each of you here today to take our understanding of play, what it means to play, what it means where we play and how we understand our world through play. This is a conversation that couldn't be more timely and relevant, and I'm just grateful that you are able to share with us today. So with that, I turn it over to Laura.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you joining us today, wherever you may be in the world. We're so happy to be here to kick off this annual meeting with such an important topic, and really thinking about equity and issues of play. And so I'm happy to kick off our conversation, and this will be a conversation between Dr. Sims, Lysa, and myself for the next hour. And we encourage all of you as attendees to please submit questions via the chat on the platform throughout our conversation. We are going to work to make sure that we preserve time for Q&A at the end of our session today. So with that, I think jumping right into framing our topic and why are we talking about equity, particularly racial equity, but broadly equity and how it intersects with issues of play. I think that if we all reflect, particularly in the United States, on what the past year has brought to all of us as an opportunity for clear-eyed reflection on how our society functions, what its strengths and its weaknesses are, particularly with respect to social well-being, mental well-being, health, and just social justice. There were a lot of opportunities for us to see some real gaps and have those recognized on a scale that they haven't been in many decades, and present quite a lot of opportunities. I'll start with talking a little bit about my own grounding in the way that we've been thinking about play and equity in the Children's Museum community, and then pass it on to my fellow panelists. Most of you all may think of children's museums as places where a lot of great play and learning happens. And while that's true, the pandemic shut down all children's museums around the world for a significant amount of time in terms of access to their physical venues. That said, what we've also seen in the last year is the way that children's museums continued to support children and families through play and playful learning over those past years, even though their venues were often closed and their usual service delivery mechanisms were taken away from them. We found a lot of muscles and relationships to really understand what our role and the role of children's museums could be in the face of the social challenges that we were all navigating throughout this time. And I think the important frame that I bring to this conversation is that in children's museums, our primary frame are children and families. And play is a mechanism for us to provide that service. And so over the past year, with respect to play, we saw some significant challenges that I think are probably obvious to everybody here and my colleagues on the call. We lost freedom of movement. Most of us lost freedom of movement. From a child and family perspective, so much of the infrastructure that we rely on for well-being and support, like schools, doctors' offices, healthcare, public facilities, was severely curtailed, either through regulatory shutdowns to keep us safe from the pandemic, where access to physical spaces was severely restricted, or through health advice, where leaving our homes often was highly discouraged. And we saw the equity dynamics and inequity dynamics really play out, particularly along racial and socioeconomic lines for families with respect to access to the healing power of play during that time. Children and families lost access or didn't feel like they should be accessing the physical spaces that they usually go to for play and bonding. In many cases, families who had never really had access to that or had limited access lost that access because of the economics of their families. So when you have adults and caregivers who didn't have the luxury of earning a living inside the home, those adults had to make some decisions about limiting the exposure of their families, particularly the children. And so that really put a stress on playful dynamics. That said, what we saw in the Children's Museum field were parents and caregivers being much, much more aware of how important access to joy, as well as the social and physical benefits of play were for their children and their families during this time of isolation. So in a positive way, I think what we saw and were able to provide some service around through our community was the value of play for children's well-being, really articulated clearly and sought after by parents. There's a lot more I can say about the gaps in our country about fulfilling those needs, but I think we're going to talk about that in the next hour. And then I'll say the last thing, particularly the pandemic is not the only crisis that happened this year in this country. We also have seen a tremendous uptick in racial inequities, particularly racial violence, that has been threatening families of color for generations in this country, but certainly was accelerated this year. That also made access to joy very important, particularly for adults and parents, caregivers of color, to be able to support their children in the face of some really scary times. And that's the landscape that we were seeing in the Children's Museum field, very, very broadly articulated, and where we're working from in terms of thinking about children's museums as mechanisms for filling the equity gaps for families in the communities that we serve. But I'd like to now move on to my esteemed colleagues to get some of their own framing and thinking about play and equity. And so I'll ask Dr. Sims first. Can you share with us and our attendees how you position play in your work as a mechanism for community and cultural survival with the educators you work with?
Sure. Thank you, Laura. um, First of all, as Stephanie mentioned in the beginning of this session, my area of focus is with Native American communities, especially with regard to the maintenance and revitalization, in many cases, of their languages. In most of my work at the University of New Mexico is providing the kind of support and training support, and also the um, the kind of support that local communities need to establish language programs for young children. And even more so within the last, I would say, last decade, the emphasis has become also more on early childhood as a starting place for many of these language efforts. So given that background, my work with language speakers who are tasked with teaching these languages has primarily been this consciousness raising, I guess you could call it, in terms of the importance of using just natural everyday experiences in which to teach language, not in the ways that we often look at language instruction in academic settings. So play and the natural engagement of children in hands-on activities things that involve them perhaps doing things with adults, grandparents especially. Those are the mechanisms by which we encourage families and communities to think that the grounding for language use comes, especially for young children. And I would even say even older children, not just young children, but I think all children, even maybe adults, love that part of play, right? Because it engages, it's a social context and social cultural context many times for families. And this is what we try to reemphasize during this period of the pandemic, when there was a shutdown, if you will, in many communities. And the shutdown really involved people not going in and out of villages, to go to a store maybe that's in the nearby town and all of that. And so many families were reliant, native families were reliant, especially those living on reservation lands, to stay put. And much of the language instruction that would normally have gone on in the setting of schools wasn't possible because of the restrictions on person to person kind of contact. So much of what the many language teachers pivoted to, of course, was then you having to resort to this technology, which I would tell you was very foreign to many of our elder people, our fluent speakers, because as Laura mentioned, what the pandemic actually really did was surface the inequities to access to such things as technology. Many of even my own home on the reservation where I live in northwestern New Mexico, we don't have broadband service, and people in school districts scurry to find ways to try to connect kids, to the internet by putting hotspot, those little jet packs on school buses. And then the school buses would go, to certain spots on the reservation, and that's where it was expected the kids would come around towards a bus to just even get internet connections. So the equities that surfaced as a result of the pandemic, were really right out there, because we could say that many of our Native American students, um, suffered the results of not being able to keep up by using this technology. On the other hand, when it came to play and things, what I think that many of our families and our language speakers came to realize more and more, hey, we don't have to be tied to technology to do the things that we do normally in our families. Why not go out and play with the children? Why not encourage the children to be outside in their own, settings, not going out to play with the children, but basically, to play and do things using the things you have around the home. And that's the one thing we kept emphasizing with our language teachers. You don't need, books and all of this stuff to do the kinds of language experiences that can come from just doing things, making things using what you have at home. And it harkens back to a time when, even when I was growing up, we didn't have a lot of toys. We didn't have commercial toys. And the play that we engaged in was the kind of play where you used your imagination, So when after a good spring, a summer rain out in the Southwest, of course, we love rain, but once that rain settled on the dirt and the sand, it would dry up very quickly. And so we get these cracked mud pieces in the road, on our roads near our houses. And those cracked pieces of mud became our plates, and so you use the imagination of what you had in the natural environment. And this is what we were telling teachers: use the things that are readily there, because play also involves that creative, imaginative a skill set that oftentimes we think play is, so hand the child something you buy at the store or off the shelf, and when actually the mind is challenged by making things symbolize something else, no? And part of that value of play then comes in utilizing those skill sets. So when you ask me what's the grounding in terms of play in our work, yes, play for us in terms of our cultural context is very important. It's that imaginative, creative aspect that comes out when you use play as a way to symbolize something else maybe that a child has seen or experienced in his own culture. And it's kind of a rehearsal. Often when you observe children, they're rehearsing things that they have seen in their communities, but they do it their own way. And so play for us is part of that cultural means to remember, okay, to recall, because many of our cultural foundations and our languages are what I call oral-based traditions, okay? Many of the things that we have in our histories and the things we do culturally are not written down in a book. You can't just take it off the shelf and say, here, learn about our culture. No, a lot of what we know as Native Americans are experiences through live experiential learning. And so that connection to play for children is very important then, because again, it continues that memory of how we do things in our communities, and it also brings to that consciousness about how we as adults can't be lured all the time by uses of technology. That there's something to be said about just doing things with children, making things with children. So I'll end there just for my part, but we can keep on discussing.
Oh, there's so much to pull from.
I know.
I think after that, but thank you so much for that introduction to your work and your frame, Dr. Sims. And we know that we have things we want to jump onto, but I would like to invite Lysa also to share with us about the way you at Kaboom and yourself also you all are thinking about play through an access and community development lens, and know that you all have some really exciting emergent thinking on equity. And I'd love to give you some space to share that and build on anything that Dr. Sims has also shared. I saw you taking notes as well.
Yeah,
So
that's exactly. Yeah, that's exactly what I'm going to do. I want to build on what's already been shared because it's so important. So as Stephanie mentioned, I'm the CEO of Kaboom. We've been around for 25 years, and our work has been all about bringing communities and kids together to design and then build their spaces, their play spaces. This past couple of years, we have been going through our own self-reflection and our own reckoning around, we exist because we know the importance of play. We know that the currency of childhood, and I would even argue that the currency of us as human beings is play. And I think we really saw that last year, that I play in the dirt, and I don't know if I would have kept my peace of mind if I didn't have my garden to be able to play in. Yes, it is especially true for our kids. The reckoning that we've been going through as an organization for the past couple of years, that I think all of us have really had to face this past year in particular, is that there's a history here. So in this country, there is a history of segregation, of racialized disinvestment, of really building a system in our country that disinvests in Black, Brown, Indigenous people and communities. And we're dealing with the effects of that, not just the structural effects of that, but the cultural ones. And so this past year, as we've been in this intersection of the inequities that we've been seeing, and the killings and pain and everything else, along with us having to be at home and kind of take away the things that are really special to us, has forced us to look at how do we operate differently.
And so at Kaboom, though we've been doing amazing work that really lifts up community voice to think about and design and then build their own spaces, until we get into the root of the systemic issues around where the disparities exist, we are not going to be able to build a place that is equitable for all, knowing that, as I just argued, play is the currency, I think, of humanity, of human beings. And so though our work has been about bringing communities and people together and working in child serving organizations, doing playgrounds at children's museums or boys and girls clubs or at our public parks or our schools, we've really had to pause and tell ourselves that, we have to work smarter, and we have to take a long lens on our work where we're really looking at the more systemic issues, looking at data to inform where has there been disinvestment. That is where we're going to focus our work. We're going to use our process to lift up community voice so that they are engaged and they are the authors of what their space looks like. And then I think most people know that we have a wonderful and robust volunteerism model that is really an opportunity to unify and heal around play and around kids. And so how do we bring that in as a way to not just center communities, not just center racialized disinvestment and focus on that, but really as a mechanism for bringing people together to collaborate and heal. I think the last thing I'll say is, as we look forward and think about our work, this year, I think the quote of our nation and our world would probably be that it's been tough. It is also revealed that as we as adults have been really trying to navigate all of the challenges that have been created over hundreds of years, our kids, literally their childhood was put on pause last year. And so we are really challenging ourselves not only to think about how do we become more data informed and disciplined and committed for the long term to working in communities, how do we start to partner better with the sector so that as we care for our kids who have just gone through the madness, not only of the past year, but all of the challenges that have happened in the years before that, how do we do better to get organized and not only prioritize play as the currency of their childhood in their everyday life, in their school, in their homes, but create the infrastructure around them that facilitates and shows them that their childhood is important and that they have equitable spaces to be able to play in. That's a lot, but those are all the things that are really on our mind right now that, there is just, we've been around for 25 years and have been saying recently that we have to do in 5 years what we did in the past 25 to really impact this generation of kids to change the trajectory of our future.
Thank you. Thank you for that. And so I want to actually pull on some things that both of you all said in our next round of reflections and thinking about structural and systematic changes, and Dr. Sims also reflecting on, play as a perpetuator of culture. This is a way that we create multi-generational understanding and knowledge transfer, and that's culture building and that's heritage building. So one of the things that I know that we are particularly interested in the Children's Museum community, because play is multifaceted. Our involvement with play is multifaceted. We are, Lysa, as you said, sites for play, sometimes the only site for free play in many communities, or the safest site, if you will. Play is also our pedagogy. Dr. Sims, as you talked about, our exhibits are often aligned with developmental or academic content standards. And so it's a complex landscape for children's museums as we think about play. But in our moment of reflection and the opportunities for service that we've been given in the past year, I think where we are thinking about is really reflecting on whose concept of play we're drawing from and centering and prioritizing and for what purposes. And I think from an equity perspective, often is even in academia, the literature about play, tries to define it as culturally neutral, et cetera. But we know that play is a human behavior, and humans are cultural beings. That's what we do. And often what's idealized around play, right? There's even a notion of a playground, right, Lysa? And Dr. Sims, as you were talking about certain kinds of play and technology even, really come from centering a Eurocentric middle class vision of what play is. And so I know we're thinking about, whose vision of play are we centering in our work, or what are we using play for? Are we using play as an assimilation technique? Are we using play to help all children survive in a system that we excel in a system that we know is biased and isn't equitable, which is most of our public schooling, we know is not an equitable system? Or can we use play as a mechanism for helping to disrupt those systems? So those are things that we're thinking about, and I'd love to open it up to the two of you, maybe to share some of your own thinking about what are the assumptions that we might need to critique to really bring an inclusive and equitable approach to our work on play for survival. Dr. Sims or Lysa, I don't know which one of you would like to go first.
I can jump in, and then
Great.
Sims, you can build on it. I'd say, just because of how it works, we have a really unique point of view on this. Every single project that we build is different because it's designed by the community. And so when I think about, culturally, everybody plays different, everybody values different things. I was at a project a couple of years ago where they wanted to include a game that I had never heard of on the playground, but they thought I was crazy because I had never heard of it. But it was very important to that community. That was how they played. And so I think that we have to make sure, whether we are leading a park system, or we are a school superintendent, or we are a community member, that we are acknowledging that the people using the space or the people engaging in an activity are the experts. And it is presumptuous for us to come in and prescribe what play looks like. It is in our nature to play and use it to work through stress, to learn through play, to build relationships through play. But the creators of what play looks like should be the people who are playing. And so I think, I celebrate this part of Kaboom often, the community-informed design, because I think that it is so critical to acknowledging and empowering the people who are going to use the space, rather than, me from DC going into San Jose and saying, this is how you play. Just being able to facilitate and to have a dialogue about understanding, what do you need? Is it play for young kids? Do you need multi-generational space? Is it older kids? What does play look like for you? And how do we facilitate an environment and bring together the resources to bring that to life? I think that is absolutely necessary as we think about how we address play, that whether it be in a house or with an individual child or the infrastructure of play, we have to listen to the people and contextualize our work based on what they are experiencing.
I think those are really good points, Lysa, because that is true. Our concepts of play oftentimes ignore that very essential aspect of looking at the social cultural lens of play. And when we look at the science of, for example, early childhood education, there's still oftentimes that dominant mainstream model of what play should be. And so it's also, I think, oftentimes with that notion that we compartmentalize play as something separate from what we do as work. You know, even with children, you know, there's a set time, and the academics has largely carried that particular perspective of there are things when you do according to time, right? So it's time to work, it's time to do your lessons, and then you play afterwards, you know. So I think a lot of that idea of play as a natural part of how we learn things has often been disrupted for a lot of indigenous communities because of this preponderance of how we do, you know, the work of schooling, and play is somehow just something that's, you know, on the side, when in fact for many communities around the world, you know, children's learning comes by play. So yes, you're right that, you know, the community has to, they're the experts in terms of them knowing their children, right? And the community knowing what it is that binds them together. And so when we look at play through that lens, then you can't help but having to take time to listen to what communities say. These aspects of multi-generational coming together is oftentimes a part of play, you know, where children are doing things with, you know, multiple generations. And again, like I said, that concept of compartmentalizing play is something that just the children do by themselves. That's not how we operate in communities, no. So going back to those essential foundations, I think are key um, to uh, organizations that may want to support communities, children. That has to be the starting point, you know. Otherwise, we're spinning our wheels and perhaps doing something that actually disrupts, you know, the kind of ways in which communities help their children to learn. So yes, definitely, those are essential.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I think that we also need to bringing in this idea of academic framing as well, because the academy does frame so much what those of us who are working in maybe lay people fields, policy fields, practitioners, also shapes their own conceptualizations of, to your point, Dr. Sims, what's work, what's play, and even what is the best kind of play. And I want to bring this from our perspective on sort of cultural, what cultural models of play we're prioritizing or elevating or valuing, which are, you know, they are cultural, is that often in our community, child-led play, and child-led in a very specific way, is what is our experiences are even designed for. And what we are, for various reasons, but I think in this moment and in the coming years, being much more aware of is, at least in our venues, children 0 to 8 years old don't bring themselves to a children's museum. Often an adult is with them. And you know, what's best about the experience is when there's multi-generational interaction in our experiences. And so what we're seeing is the tension of this notion of child-led, which tends to be a very Eurocentric definition of child-led experiences, to multi-generational experiences, and being able to embrace what sometimes are called apprentice model learnings amongst generations, that you were saying, the exploration of their world and the showing and getting critique or feedback from the adult, and them going back and forth, and that kind of playful dialogue being valued. And I would say that a few years ago, in many children's museums environments, you might have staff on the floor telling the adult to, like, let the child go, let them go, and interrupting that intergenerational dialogue that is so important for bonding, even for cultural transmission and preservation? How can they tell their own stories in those experiences? And so I think it's really, I'm pulling this all the way back to thinking about for those who are doing research in academia around play, thinking about how that actually plays out in an equity landscape. How is your work being interpreted and being used, could be used as a tool for equity, or maybe not. I think that's a challenge that is something that we are thinking about as well, in navigating this landscape around equity. Lysa?
No, I'm over here frantically taking notes. Student over here. You know what it brings up for me is this past year we have really been paying attention to the sense of belonging, right? And you know, for us, we have historically focused on making sure that the infrastructure, the play infrastructure is there. But I think we also have to acknowledge that when you play, that should be your freest self, right? You should just be fully free to experience, to grow, to learn, to manipulate what you're playing with. But there is this layer because of racism, quite honestly, like the history of our country, where there is another thing that we need to consider, and that's how people feel in their public space or when they are playing. Are they able to fully show up and get the full benefits of play because they feel a sense of freedom, whether it's, you know, someone stopping them or telling them when to stop and start playing or segmenting play, or if people are policing them in their space and they feel like they have to be on guard. To get the true benefits of play, there also has to be a freedom in it that comes from feeling like I have full permission to be in this space, whether I'm interacting with an adult or not, or I'm playing with my friends, or I'm playing by myself. I am fully free to get the benefits of play. And I'm also fully free to not feel like I am being judged or something's going to go wrong because I am accessing my play space and the experiences that come from play. And I think that we need to acknowledge that layer if we are looking at and studying the benefits of play, that there are barriers for people to fully have the full benefits because of that sense of, or lack of that sense of freedom and belonging that exists.
Thank you. So we have about 5 minutes left, and I'd love, Dr. Sims, I think Lysa set up a wonderful segue, because I think that sense of belonging, especially in the work that you do around heritage and cultural preservation, and, you know, using that everyday world, right?
Yeah.
Is powerful. And I'd like to give you that opportunity to talk to us before we move into closing our session.
I would just like to add that you know, that sense of belonging and the sense of linking to something that is culturally yours, it is so important in when we provide the opportunities for children to explore that in their way, use and play. You know, it's also, I think, with the idea that adults often times, as well-meaning as they might be, also have to kind of step back and be observant of children and really listening to what children talk about in their play. You know, and I will just mention very quickly, you know, when my grandson was about 3 or so, he would pretend play, and all it would just kind of come out of the blue, and you know, the adults might be sitting there, and all of a sudden, you know, the little grandson comes around, and he's mimicking things that he's seen us do in our community, and he's actually drawing us into the pretend play that he's doing. And one time when we were sitting there, he was going through these activities that had to do with a ceremony that we had at home. And right away I thought, oh, this child is rehearsed, and he's calling us to engage with him in this play. And so I told my son and my daughter-in-law, who at the time were sitting there, I said, go along with him, and talk to him in our language, the way these things normally happen. So that engagement of children inviting you to participate in their play is also very important. And it does give them that sense of belonging. It gives them that sense of linking back to other generations as well in their own families and communities.
Thank you so much for that.
Mhm.
Thank you. We do have a couple of questions that actually align with some of our additional questions, which is good. As we move forward. And one of the questions that's come through, and Lysa, you mentioned this earlier today in your opening comments, but we have a question maybe to give a little bit more time from each of our perspectives on what we think the repercussions are going to be for children having to put in some cases, their childhood, quote unquote, on pause over the past year. And Lysa, I'll start with you and we can take our moments.
Yeah, I mean, we're already starting to hear about it. We're already starting to see the research that's getting published around suicide rates are up. We historically talk about learning loss over summer, but the data on learning loss, there's also a lot of data on, I think it was like 3 million kids unaccounted for as to whether or not they're even going to school. And so it's already starting to be revealed what the impact has been this past year. And I think there's more to come, which I think is all the more reason for us to just double down on counteracting that impact. I mean, when we're talking about increased suicide rates of our kids because of this past year, because they are disconnected from their schools and their friends and exposed to who knows what, because they don't have the normal community and filters to protect them. That's already like coming to light. So there was a New York Times article I think I read that really pointed to a lot of data that we're starting to see around, childhood being put on hold, kids not being able to going to school, kids being in conditions that are not desirable for a healthy upbringing. So we're already starting to see it, and I'm sure more studies will come, but it really does elevate the urgency for us to prioritize the safety, well-being, and life of our kids. You're on mute, Lada.
Dr. Sims, do you have anything to add to that?
Yes, I would say some of the repercussions of being isolated, in many families and communities are showing up, I think, in those early statistics that are being reported. I don't think we know the full depth of that and what that means yet, and that surely probably will come long after this thing is over, this pandemic. But I would say just as well, we also need to study and look at ways in which families and children have been resilient. Because while I don't discount some of the negative kinds of things that have resulted as as a outcome of this pandemic shutdown that we've had, I would also say that there are probably also some stories about resilience and how is it that families and children have been able to continue some of the things that, it may be a return to some of the things that they didn't used to do. I mean, I kind of laugh because again, with my grandchildren, I said, I haven't flown kites in a while. And when the children were home, we made kites, we flew kites, and grandma was out there running around flying kites. I haven't done that since I was a kid. you know. And so
Mhm.
maybe there's also those stories of re-engagement, you know, what has moved families to do the very things that maybe they've forgotten as adults, you know. So yeah, I think that we need both of that kind of data to really show the full impact. Mhm.
Yeah, I'd agree. And I agree with you that one of the things from our perspective as we're thinking about and talking with folks in public health, from a public health perspective, particularly mental health, is that the strongest indicators for how children's mental health is, particularly youngest children, but overall children, is how the adults in their lives have managed their stress during the pandemic. That's the number one indicator of their well-being right now. And that's something we're really thinking about. And I think, to your point, that idea of family resilience, which we know is complex and relies on all these, is very affected by all these structural inequities, Lysa, that you have been talking about, that some of the questions we think about are, I'd say, maybe to say a radical statement, for children and the whole notion of learning loss, is maybe one of the things that this year showed us is that the systems that we have to support children and families don't really support children and families.
I think
They
that's
don't.
true. It's
They
very true.
don't
Yeah.
in the way they should. And
Yeah.
is
Yeah.
this a moment to think about that?
And maybe sometimes we've put too much stock in those things, and then now it's surfaced in terms of, well, they don't always serve everybody, and they don't always serve all children in the way we think they do. So
Yeah.
again, it's re-examining, you know, our assumptions that, you know, these things are work for everyone in the same way. Well, I'm sorry, but maybe they don't.
I'll put an exclamation point on the resiliency piece, because I think that's our great challenge right now. That's the possibility, is how do we reduce the trauma for our
Yes.
families, and how do we build resiliency, which is like, that's what we want to see. We can't protect people from negative experiences, but we can
Yes.
use them in a way that doesn't create trauma, that
Right.
really strengthens and builds resiliency, particularly for the kids that have a long future ahead of them.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I want to give a little bit of space to another question that was asked, and it's more around the policy, in the policy arena. And we have, certainly in this country, a total turnover in leadership at the national level, with some exciting changes potentially at, in some federal agencies that directly affect really the landscape of play, both with the naming of new secretaries of the Department of Interior, with Deb Haaland at the Department of Secretary of Interior. That certainly affects the Park Service and some of our thinking about recreation and outdoors at the national level, and our new Secretary of Education as well, that is coming on. And just opening a question to what extent any of us, any of you think that that might open up some opportunities for perhaps some of this change that we just started to talk about, that could be on the horizon.
I can jump in. We are investing in our government affairs work in ways that we haven't in the past, because in a lot of ways, you know, we're screaming out into a dark hole if we don't play a role in influencing policy and budgets and federal, state, local decision makers to prioritize civic infrastructure, to prioritize our kids, our schools with an equity lens. That's where the big systemic change comes from. And so we are certainly doubling down on our role in the sector. You know, this is not something we go at alone. This is something we need to be partnering with others, and have been working closely with independent sector and many peers on this. But we've got to influence federal government to prioritize civic investments and infrastructure investments in a way that is equitable, and really, in our case, all of our case, really prioritizes our kids and communities that have been disinvested in. Absolutely necessary.
You know, I agree with hopefully with the new leadership in place, there is a change in focus in terms of how we look at the education of all of our children, across the nation, especially those populations that have been marginalized, by unfortunate policies that have been carried out with the last administration. I just I'm hopeful, I guess is probably the right word right now. But I think we also need to be vigilant in terms of making sure that our new leadership also is aware of the inequities that have existed and how they can lead by policies that will enable communities and families to thrive, rather than being under the thumb of top-down policies that have never worked. And they certainly, within this last administration, so many things in education basically were just wiped out, because there was not informed leadership at the top level. There was not informed policy at the top level. And so I'm hoping that with this new administration, the leaders that are now in place in these different agencies will do a better job of listening and learning from our own communities across the nation. So again, like I said, that's my hope. and hopefully we will see some things change.
Thank you. We have one more question, and do you all have a few more minutes? Okay, just a couple more minutes. Another question that we have is one of our participants referring to the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, which names the importance of cultural life and art and how that aligns with a child's right to play. And have any of us ever used it as a tool to educate adults on play? I certainly have an answer for this, but if either of you all.
Go ahead, Lara.
Okay, so I think the first thing I'll say is that for that commenter, and I don't know if folks in the audience are aware of the Convention of the Rights of the Child, but the United States has not signed on to the Convention of the Rights of the Child, and I think that that is reflective of some of the things we've been talking about today. And so in our community, it has actually been the clarion call for how so much of the modern children's museum community has been built since the declaration, I think in 1954. That actually has been the motivator from a philanthropic perspective that has really fueled the growth of children's museums, that they have a right to a cultural life, and they, on their terms, that's for them, and a right to learning that and development that is based in values play. While I and the Children's Museum community, we're so honored to exist, I think one of the challenges to us is that our organizations exist because nothing else was taking that space up. And so I think that there's an ideal world where, not that no children's museums wouldn't be needed, but that there would be a healthy ecology where it would be an obvious part of any healthy community. But we're not there yet. And while we use the convention, because our policy infrastructure doesn't value play, there's nowhere where we can say, so this is where we would measure, because we're a measuring society, where we would measure that this is important and that play would be funded. That doesn't exist anywhere. And I think from a systemic perspective, until we change systems, Lysa, to your point, that we say our systems and our government and our money values play, without that, we're always going to be in an uphill battle. That's my perspective. That's my TED talk.
Standing ovation.
Well, and which is, yeah, well, which is why I'm saying our leadership needs to be informed, because if they don't, then yeah, they're gonna get people who are reluctant to, sign such things. I mean, even the rights of indigenous languages has been something that the U.S. has not wanted to sign on as a UN policy. And so when you have leadership that isn't informed about why these are important, policy things that they need to come on board, then they'll continue to resist,
And I would say informed, acknowledge, receipt of that,
Yeah.
and accountable, and putting practices into place that stand, government turnover, that, don't come in and out of an administration.
Right.
So I think that accountability on the back end is also necessary.
Yes, definitely.
Absolutely.
Mhm.
Well, we have come to the end of our hour together and our questions. I know Stephanie is going to come on and join us again on camera to help us close out, but I know I want to say a special thank you to Lysa and to Dr. Sims for joining us today on this panel, and so glad to be in your company. And Stephanie, I'll pass it to you.
Well, thank you, Laura. It's sort of like Lysa said, I'm so glad I didn't have to be on camera, because the entire time I was frantically taking notes, and I hope that I can read those notes when this is all done, because what a tremendous way to start our conference. One of our attendees in the comments that you don't get to see said that there's so much to think about and unpack here. And it's clear that this is just the beginning of the conversation, and she is absolutely right. I mean, spot on. I loved hearing each of your perspectives, taking play as survival from a programmatic perspective, from an education and language acquisition perspective, looking at our place spaces and environments and access to all those things, and equitable access to all of those things. And it's just been so rich, and shaking up the assumptions that so many people have about what play looks like, and what we call play, and why we need play. So you have opened the door, and I can't wait for our attendees to walk right in and just keep the conversation going. So thank you so much to each of you for your contributions, for the work you continue to do in this community. I'm grateful for you all as partners and friends, and look forward to many more of these kinds of conversations. So thank you all, and thanks to all who are with us live today. And this will be recorded, and folks can continue to watch it over and over again if you need to, because we might have to take some more notes. But I hope that this is only the beginning of this kind of conversation. So
thank you, Stephanie.
Thank you all.
Thank
and I hope you have a wonderful weekend.
Lysa, yes. Thank you for inviting us. I enjoyed this conversation, and I hope we'll have more to come in the future. Thank you.
Absolutely honored.
Thank you.
Thank you.